Define scope is a process which is responsible for converting the requirements into a scope statement. A documentation of a requirement has to be converted in a format of a scope so we can create a product, service or a deliverable as per that defined scope. Now how to do it? So let us look at inputs of defined scope. We need to know what do we want to work on, what are our outputs, what is the expectation of our end customer, and the expectation or needs or a requirement of our end users are communicated to us in a form of charter initially. So we got a project charter, it was talking about what is needed, what is expected from this project. And the second document which we got, which is also communicating the expectation of the software, is requirement documentation. Now this requirement documentation which we prepared in our previous process is capturing the need expectations of end users. So we have what coming from here. Now this what may also have a details of why do we need all those features. So the goals, the direction or the needs are coming from charter and requirement document. Now how are we going to manage or define our scope is coming from scope management plan. This we created in our previous process, plan scope management, and this will guide us that how are we going to convert or analyze this requirement documentation into a project scope statement, and later on how are we going to control the execution of the scope. We also need to know our enterprise environmental factor because they also constitutes on how things work in this organization, how do we visualize and how the external environment like availability of manpower or availability of alternatives. For example, you have a specific need but that material is not available, so you need to go with an alternative option even though that need is not 100% getting met because of this alternative. But if you have an environmental condition, you may need to take that option. So you need to take environmental factor which will bring as a constraint or which will tell about the surrounding atmosphere which is required when you plan about the scope. So what do? We got the need, we know how to do it, we need to put our mind to it. We put expert judgment. Now this expert judgment we may do at an individual level, we may also conduct a facilitation workshop. A facilitated workshop will help all these experts to think about a given problem in a structure and identify what is needed. Now facilitated workshop is another tool and technique. Now there is not a one way of satisfying requirement. There are various ways you can meet that particular requirement. For example, my requirement is if I am I'm creating a job portal, I say that I should be able to search job. That is my requirement. Now this requirement can be met in various ways. I may have a one type of interface where I put my queries and I get the result. I may have a file upload where I store my search criteria and I export the output in an Excel file and email comes to me in a form of predefined queries. So these people, first they think of a requirement that user needs a search facility. After that they think of how it can be met, what all features, what all functionalities we should include in our end product so it can meet it, the need of searching. And while analyzing this, they may also talk about alternatives. You may find various ways of satisfying the same need. So they do an alternative generation and alternative prioritization. They generate alternatives. They identify which one suits the best to meet this particular requirement or this particular need. So alternate generation is also one of the tools and technique. Now if you are working on a product, means your output is a product, then you may also use product analysis as a tool and technique. Now product analysis is another subject which talks about how you analyze the need, a specification by doing value engineering, by way of identifying the interaction of the end user with the product and identify what are the best features, what is the best way of satisfying the needs. So the complete focus is converting this requirement documentation into a scope statement which gives us an elaborated way of working. And by working on this scope, we should be able to satisfy or meet the requirement. So the output comes as a project scope statement. Now project scope statement will have things like project scope, it will have product scope. Project scope talking about catering requirements which are related to project like weekly demonstration, reporting requirements, etc. will fall under project scope. Product scope, so what are the features, the characteristic the end deliverable should have. It may also have a list of deliverables. The deliverable should have acceptance criteria attached. We may have an acceptance criteria at a project level. So the project scope statement also have acceptance criteria. It will also have assumptions, because now don't think that this document is going to be made at once. It's possible, depending upon life cycle or even in the productive life cycle, it's possible to elaborate it progressively. So we are nowhere recommending that you have to do everything on the first month of the project and come up with a detailed project scope statement for the complete work. So you may have assumptions, you may put you may also record constraints. That okay, these are things are not available, this technology is not available, this material is not available, or the budget is limited. So all these are constraints which are stopping or which are giving a boundary to your solution. You may want to do many things, but because of these constraints, your solution is getting limited. So your alternatives are getting limited. So these are some of the sections. You may have more sections which is talking about possible risk and some other sections which are related to project scope statement. Along with this, we have another output, or the defined scope process may update project documents. Now project documents, I want to mention a specifically one document which is definitely going to be updated with the defined scope process is requirement traceability matrix. Now we spoke about requirement traceability matrix where the requirement was mentioned. Now here we need to tell that which section, which particular deliverable of your scope statement is catering to this particular requirement. Ideally, at the end of defined scope process, we should have a mapping of requirement against the planned deliverables. We will tell that this particular screen will take care of your search need. So in summary, the defined process is a process which converts the user language requirements into a project team language of project scope statement. And this project scope statement, we will take it forward for planning and execution.